Ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this group meeting. Our first speaker this evening is Lars Chritensen. Mr. Chritensen is the Chief Executive of Saxo Bank, which he co-founded in 1992. Saxo Bank is an online Danish investment bank with worldwide interests, which remain privately owned. Mr. Chritensen has immense experience of financial markets and their regulation. In the UK, we have many individuals heading up financial institutions who are merely hired hands. Their views and comments are often tailored to secure their own perceived personal advancement. In Denmark, Lars Chritensen is known for engaging in debates on political issues and social affairs. Saxo Bank is also a generous supporter of sporting and charitable causes. Lars is a critic of both the EU's economic policies and its undemocratic handling of power to an unaccountable, technocratic elite. Ladies and gentlemen, Lars Chritensen.
Well, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. I hope you have not mismanaged people's expectations, but I shall try to talk a little bit about my experience of where the EU is today and possibly what there is to do about it. This is an important year, I think it's fair to say. We have the European elections in about 3 months' time, and I think it's very important that those elections actually send a clear message to politicians around Europe. But I think for all of us that have a skepticism or more towards the EU, this is a time to actually help spread the word and make sure that a loud and clear message goes out at the next election. People need to understand the risk that is inherent in the EU, that they get less and less opportunity to get heard, and this is one of the few opportunities where there is an opportunity to express dissent and dissatisfaction with where Brussels is taking us. Now, it all looked a little bit better some years back, I think, and I've actually been interested in politics since I was a kid. So I remember when Denmark entered the EEC at the time after a popular referendum, actually the same time as Britain, although I was only 9 years old at the time. And I remember that referendum, October 2nd, 1972, was something that was positive in our family. I was out of a conservative family, and it was clearly perceived as something positive, because that was the feeling and the spirit in Denmark at the time. We had a voter turnout of more than 90%, and 2 out of 3 Danes voted actually for Denmark going into the EEC at the time. I stayed positive for many years as I grew up, and even being a member of the Danish Young Conservatives, we were supporters of the European Union back then. I can remember some of the members even wore blue and yellow EU socks as a symbol of this attractive long-term vision. I'm pleased to say I didn't, but that was probably more because I tried to look cool, and even then those symbols were not particularly cool to look at, certainly not in the socks. But in spite of having this relatively positive point of departure, which I think many people had towards the EU, I think that over time this support and this optimism has evaporated slowly but surely. The massive central bureaucracy combined with Brussels' complete arrogance and lack of respect for independence and history and culture of the nation states is slowly destroying confidence in the project, and certainly did it for me a long time ago. I must admit it took too long for me to recognize what the European project really was about. But I can see that recognition is coming much later to many others, but it is coming, and to most of our career politicians, though it hasn't come yet. But I think we can more or less conclude that the citizens of Europe, the peoples of Europe, they are beginning to smell a rat there. And I think from this point onwards, it's going to get increasingly difficult, increasingly uphill for the EU fanatics to push through new measures. But there's no reason to not suspect that they will be trying again and again in mostly undemocratic ways. So why did it go so wrong for the EU? Well, many reasons. You know, the ideology, of course, of the statists and the bureaucrats that took control of the whole organization. The clear contempt for democracy, the underlying hatred and distrust of capitalism, and the fear of markets that are not controlled and hence might force some discipline on politicians and their spending. Their willingness to sacrifice millions of people's jobs and lives and savings to a failed vision, and all of this in a complete contempt of the reality that surrounds them. I think this contempt is nowhere more evident than in the case of the euro. The euro has sadly buried Southern Europe in uncompetitiveness and economic failure. In some countries, it's made more than 50% of the young generation unemployed, and as we know, if young people stay unemployed for too long, they eventually become unemployable, and I think that's beginning to happen in several countries. But it's really the same thing happening in all the countries. There's a difference to where they are on the curve, but some of them are ahead of the average, some of them are behind, but ultimately they will all end up in the same uncompetitive place over time. We were some people, some economists, some traders, some financial industry people that warned about this all along. In my country, it was very few, and we were very ridiculed by the establishment. But it turned out that we were right, and I think the euro has now so indisputably shown its true colors that anyone with a rational view of the world must see the common currency as a historic failure of monstrous proportions. It's a failure that will lead to even further fatal consequences for Europe and the whole continent's competitiveness vis-à-vis the rest of the world. There is one thing that can save and rescue the euro. Mind you, not rescue Europe, but rescue the euro per se as the ideological imperative that it seems to have become to its semi-religious followers. That one thing is a much further reaching integration between euro countries, common financial policy, joint issuance of government debt, a willingness to pay enormous transfers from the richer to the poorer countries, or more specifically from Germany to everybody else. And that will, if it was to happen, leave many nations with proud histories and proud heritage as poor regions of a greater Germany. So that is a possible route to save the euro, at least for some period of time, but it's obviously not a desirable one. Certainly not for the citizens who, in this case and so many other cases, seem to now have fundamentally different opinions and fundamentally different interests than their politicians. To do this integration would mean giving up national independence to an extent that is not acceptable to the voters, and precisely because of that lack of acceptance, it can only be accomplished in an undemocratic manner, and that's exactly what's happening. Unfortunately, democracy is not very highly regarded in Brussels. Personally, although I was born and lived many years in Denmark, I've had enough of the EU for some time. So I moved to Switzerland 3.5 years ago. In Switzerland, we actually respect democracy, and we vote about most things actually in referendums. Even this past weekend, among other things, the very important matter of more snow cannons in St. Moritz was up for a referendum and approved by a considerable margin. You may have noticed there was another vote in Switzerland over the weekend, which was a little bit more controversial. But personally, I was pleased to see that the Swiss people finally took a stance against the EU. The proposal that was on vote was, frankly, a rather populistic and fluffy proposal, not very clear. So I saw it more as a general protest vote against the excessive arm twisting that my newly adopted homeland experiences from the EU every day in terms of actually conforming to EU rules, although Switzerland is not a member. I also saw that vote as the first significant warning of what is to come, I think, from frustrated populations in the coming years. I think, and I hope that it will be followed by a massive protest vote in May for the European Parliament elections. I think there's a chance an EU skeptical group consisting as it is of many different groups, some more sympathetic than others, but there's a chance that group could be the biggest in the European Parliament soon. Now, of course, the EU are already aggressively commenting on the implications for Switzerland. Its access to trade with EU member states, as if there really needed to be any connection between free trade and I think a reasonable and understandable wish to have some influence on who you allow to come into your country. Now, Switzerland already has 23% foreigners in their population. I'm one of them, so I'm grateful for the stance that Switzerland has vis-a-vis, in all humbleness, contributing and net cost beneficial foreigners. I'm one of the beneficiaries of that. But out of these 23% foreigners in the Swiss population, there's a funny two directions of that. The 23% consume 45% of all social costs in Switzerland. They also make up 45% of the relatively few unemployed we have in Switzerland. So clearly that is an issue. On the other hand, these 23% also delivers approximately 27% of the GDP. So the question is, why is it so difficult to understand that the latter group that contributes more than average to GDP is more welcome than the former group that takes out a lot more part of the cost than the average Swiss person? It is a normal way to look at immigration in your country, in my view, and I don't see that necessarily connected to free trade per se. But the EU, of course, has only got threats and blackmail left to entice its members and allies to stay subordinated to Brussels wishes. I'm sure you recognize the scare tactics that are always being brought up also when the British position vis-a-vis the EU is discussed. It's very difficult for a rational person to understand why the EU does not recognize that it has been wrong in many ways and that many European citizens suffer because of those mistakes. It's difficult to understand why, instead of senselessly pushing forward with this failed project, why not use this crisis to reevaluate the project, to check it and to adjust the course and listen to what the European populations actually want. They want to move in a different direction, both the Danes and the Brits and the people of other EU countries. I think it's really time for politicians to understand that they are here for the sake of their citizens, not the other way around. Although I hope I'll never experience what I'm going to tell you now, I still dare to predict how strong Europe will be developing if the European Commission and the European Parliament and the Barrosos and the Van Rompuys of this world gains the power that they dream of and frankly are well on their way to achieving. So let's try to look 10 years or even shorter into the future. If it turns out the way that these gentlemen and their accomplices want, then you'll for sure have a much more uniform and considerably higher tax level across all of Europe. Eliminating tax competition, you should never forget, is very, very high on the EU agenda, although not so often mentioned. I'm also pretty sure that we will have experienced a supposedly one-off, never to be repeated wealth tax of more than 10% of your assets to sort of set the tone for trying to recover some of the debts They've already been to Cyprus, and they're coming to a country near you soon. And I can tell you, after that first one-off, never to be repeated confiscation, there will be more one-offs, never to be repeated coming shortly thereafter. There will be huge direct EU taxes going straight to the EU Commission and to the EU budget. There will be massive exit taxes and fines and other barriers for those that might want to move out of the EU. And even if you do move outside of the EU will for sure demand global taxation rights if you are unfortunate enough to be born within their borders. There will be great poverty. To some extent there already is, but there will be great poverty in a string of regions formerly known as Spain, Italy, Greece and others. There will be huge and growing powers concentrated in the hands of the Germans, possibly a little bit to the French in recognition of their support. There will be no veto rights for any national state, and smaller states like my own country will have very little influence if any. There will be economic stagnation all over the EU. The financial sector will have moved on to the US, to China, to Hong Kong, to Singapore. Industry will have moved to Asia, to the US, that seems to actually be gaining competitiveness. The young, the talented, the well-educated will be moving away in droves to follow these new economic power centers. But you should take comfort, it's not all bad. The EU will still be a leader in some areas. It will be a great world leader in symbolic and irrational activities like low CO2 discharges, green companies supported by government budgets. It will be a world leader in corporate social responsibility, I have no doubt. And it will be a world leader in many other costly and economically losing positions. There will also, which is I think very serious, be a growing suppression of freedom of speech as far as certain critical expressions are concerned with regard to other cultures, to religions, particularly to the EU itself. You already have some considerable threats against freedom of speech when it comes to criticizing the EU. And you will certainly see increased attention towards suppressing any kind of deviation or antisocial attitude like skepticism towards climate projects or skepticism towards social rights, etc. And political correctness will achieve hitherto unknown heights. I don't know if you followed the recent story, actually emanating out of my own country, Denmark, but I'm sure there will also be extensive European rules about how to manage giraffes in Copenhagen Zoo. Carnivores having their teeth pulled out, so it can be more social responsible to take the kids to the zoo, and the animals will be more friendly and more social, more like out of a Disney movie. That's probably, apart from the selfie with our Prime Minister and President Obama, which you may have seen, I think Rasmus the giraffe has really put us on the map in recent days. On the international stage, the EU will be a weak player with very low credibility and respect, and it will increasingly have to do exactly what the big creditor nations demand, because the Union will at that point be entirely dependent on their creditors. The EU will work hard in the United Nations to seek collaboration with third world countries in an attempt to force their own fantastic model onto the rest of the world that have chosen more rational models. In other words, it's not going to look great. Can we really allow this to happen? I think no. I don't think actually that politicians in Europe today has legitimacy to make decisions of this magnitude for basically undermining something that generation after generation after generation for hundreds of years have built cultures, nation states, etc. I think there's probably a limit to what a politician can reasonably assume of responsibility. I actually think many Europeans around many countries have made the same decision. Enough is enough. The failure is just too obvious. I hope very much that the European parliamentary election will be some kind of turning point. Obviously, this is taking a long time to get into this mess. It's going to take a long time to get out of it. But I do hope that a very strong signal will be sent, and I trust that Europeans know that these elections are crucial for Europe and for their nation states and for the themselves as both Europeans and members of the nations, that they have their culture and their history roots in. I think for people like us in this room, we have to make sure that Europeans across all of the nation states, that they actually understand the choice they have between a centralized, semi-totalitarian, anti-democratic, power-grabbing, incompetent group of people in Brussels, or actually trying to make the best of Europe, because there are many good things in Europe. It's not all destroyed yet. We have a huge number of citizens, wage earners, huge number of consumers. We have a well-developed free trade area. We have a lot of variation and differentiation. We have different economic systems. We have different, to some extent, competing tax systems. We have areas with low salaries that have good capacity for service and industry and manufacturing. We have other areas with high education and high salary areas with good prospects for innovation and creativity. We have the strongest and historically most important cultures in the world. We have largely a Christian legacy that brings us all together. And I also think we have not a pride of the EU, but a pride of being part of Europe, but also a pride, of course, of being citizens of our own nation states. These are two very different roads to choose, and that's why I see that these elections are probably the most important. For many, many years, they probably have relatively low participation, but they are very important, and it's up to anybody that has concerns about where the EU is going to try to help people understand how important that choice is. So if you love your country, and if you love Europe, let's not waste this chance to make an impact. We need to save Europe from the EU. So let's try to do that. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Norman Lamont here this evening, the Vice President of the Bruges Group. Norman Lamont is a man of immense political and financial experience. Before entering Parliament, he was Director of Rothschild Asset Management. Throughout his parliamentary career, he has been a strong advocate of free market economics and privatisation. He became an early supporter of Margaret Thatcher, and on the day of the first ballot for the leadership of the Conservative Party in 1975, he accompanied her to a lunch appointment at Rothschild's. Among the distinguished directors of that bank, there was, of course, Lord Victor Rothschild, former head of Ted Heath's policy. Unfortunately, lunch did not go well. And afterwards, the great lady is reported to have commented, "Never take me to that red bank again." Norman found himself drafting thank you letters for both the guest and the host. As Chancellor of the Exchequer, Norman Lamont led the negotiations which secured Britain's opt-out from the single currency. And following Britain's exit from the ERM, he put in place the monetary framework which ensured that Britain had a period of sustained low inflation, accompanied by robust growth. Currently, Lord Lamont, in addition to his role as a working peer, is also a director of and consultant to a number of leading financial institutions. He also serves as chairman of the British-Iranian Chamber of Commerce. Tonight, Lord Lamont will address us on the subject of the crisis of the euro and the eurozone.
Barry, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, thank you very much indeed for inviting me here tonight. I'm delighted as Vice President of the Bruges Group, which I've been for a very long time, to be here on the 25th anniversary of the founding of the Bruges Group after that great speech by Margaret Thatcher, a speech that I think resonates today and gives us the sort of vision of the Europe that we ought to have. I think I ought to immediately say thank you to Mr. Chritensen for coming all the way here to give us a wonderful speech full of humour and very good examples of pointless, silly European integration. It reminded me of a talk once given by Václav Klaus, the theme, where his title was "We Need Europe Without the EU," and that's what we do need. I see from the programme that tonight was under the title "Europe, a Crisis of Democracy and a Crisis of the Economy." I wanted to talk largely about the economy. As Barry said, the subject of the Euro and the Eurozone is one that is very close to my heart. They said of Mary Tudor when she died, they opened her body and found the word Calais on her heart. I think when they open mine, they might find the word Euro on my heart, because I spent the dreariest year of my life negotiating Britain's opt-out and assuring them that we were not, while I was Chancellor of the Exchequer, going to join the Euro, and the Euro was going to start without Britain being a member. And I rehearsed all the reasons against it, some of which have come to pass, some perhaps not yet, but they simply wouldn't believe it. And it was a complete dialogue of the deaf. And I still remember the shudder with which I experienced the Greek finance minister, who, believe it or not, was twice as tall as me and 3 times as broad, and he put his arm around me in front of everybody and said, "Ah, Norman, you say you will not join the Euro, but when the time comes, Britain will show solidarity with Greece." But because I spent a whole dreary year listening to all these arguments and being convinced that this couldn't work, I realized a fundamental truth. It was really driven home to me that this is not an economic idea. It is a political idea. It is a religion. The currency has very little relation to economics. And this was very well put by a Spanish economist, Pedro Schwartz, a Spaniard with a German name, who once wrote that the origin of the Euro owed more to Freud than it did to Adam Smith. And he said the reason the Euro exists, so firstly, the French are afraid of the Germans. Secondly, the Germans are afraid of the Germans. Thirdly, the Italians don't trust themselves. The Irish want to be rid of the British. The Spanish and the Portuguese want to be French. The Greeks want to face the Turks eye to eye. And the Netherlands, Belgium and Luxembourg all want a place at the top table. Well, I think that was more or less right, although he left out one thing, which was, of course, we won the war all on our own, and we don't have anything to do with all these people across the channel. But I do think that, frivolous though that was as a remark, it contains a profound truth, and the determination of European countries to keep the Euro going, whatever the political cost, whatever the cost of human suffering in terms of unemployment and youth unemployment, is deeply rooted in history. And I think 3 wars with Germany in just over 100 years, Paris occupied twice in those wars, that is deep in the French psychology. It's very difficult for us to understand. But for that reason, I've never believed that the Euro would break up quickly. I've always said it would be quite a long time. Now, recently, the Euro crisis seems to have ebbed a little. Is this crisis over? Well, I think one has to ask which crisis, because the Euro has gone from one crisis to another. It started off with a crisis about the solvency of individual governments, then it moved to doubting whether there could be any growth in the Eurozone, and now there is the threat of deflation. All this is a long, long way from 2007, when the crisis first started. I don't know if you remember in the newspapers there, people in Brussels were saying, this is an Anglo-Saxon crisis. It has nothing to do with the Euro. Well, they soon discovered otherwise. And the crisis went on and on. But Why has it ebbed recently? Well, I think it's down to one man, Mario Draghi, the President of the European Central Bank. Some of you may recall a remark by Enoch Powell when he said, "A politician's words are his deeds." And it's Mario Draghi's words that have produced an ebbing of the euro crisis, because a couple of years ago, at a very critical point when interest rates were going through the roof in the peripheral countries of Europe, Mario Draghi said that he was going to do whatever it takes to save the euro. And this was interpreted by the markets as meaning that the central bank would buy government bonds of all the countries that were in trouble, of Spain, Portugal, Ireland, and Italy. And this would keep interest rates down, it would help governments to finance their deficits. You may not think it's a very good idea for government, well, I don't either, for governments to just print money, buying their own bonds by which they're borrowing from the market. But this was what the market believed he intended to do. And it had a dramatic effect on the market. Interest rates fell back. But you know what happened? The ECB never bought a single bond. The OMT, outright monetary transactions, as this program is called, never happened. Perhaps that was just as well, because this is something that the German government might well have been strongly opposed to. A member of the ECB board, who is also a member of the Bundesbank, had resigned from the ECB over this. Only this last week, the German Constitutional Court, the Karlsruhe Court, has given a judgment saying that it looks as though, they've given a rather tentative judgment, the ECB, if it buys the bonds of Eurozone governments, may be breaking its own statutes. You can say that again, because the Maastricht Treaty very firmly says there should be no such monetary financing. This is, as I know very well, a clause that was put there by the Germans because they were terrified of this sort of thing happening. So this judgment has been referred to the European Court of Justice, who of course will rule in favour of the European Union. So the whole issue has been fudged for the moment. But as I say, this crisis has abated, but I don't believe that the story is over by any means. Interest rates could be forced up again. The United States is tapering its own bond buying program, which is widely expected to push up interest rates. The financial position of so many of the Eurozone countries is desperate. In Greece today, the ratio of debt to its economy is 175%. They've had huge retrenchment, of course. We think we've had austerity in this country, but we've had nothing compared with what is happening on the continent. The Greek economy has shrunk by 25%. That's 4 times the peak to trough fall in the economy here. That they are running a surplus now, but they'll have to run a surplus for something like 25 years in order to get their level of overall borrowing back to an acceptable level. So I think it's possible that the euro will survive, stumble on for quite a while yet. But I don't think that it is going to function properly. I think the outlook for the southern Mediterranean countries is years and years of high unemployment and a very, very slow growth. And it is a very, very fragile situation. You know, it's almost farcical. They've established 3 bailout funds for the euro. But who contributes to the bailout funds? Well, they contribute in this proportion. The funds for the bailout, which would be used if a country gets into real difficulty, 24% comes from Germany, 20% comes from France, which could get into trouble itself, 19% comes from Italy, and something like 15% comes from Spain. And if a country has to go to the bailout mechanism in order to get emergency funding, all the other countries have to pay more. Well, Italy is contributing 19%, Spain is contributing 14%. What happens if Spain and Italy have to go to the fund in order to get assistance? The whole thing is like a pack of cards that could collapse in on itself. As Mr. Christian said, there are one or two steps that could be taken to strengthen the euro. You could have a banking union. In fact, you can't really have a single currency without having a proper banking union. That involves a common deposit insurance scheme. You know how in the UK you deposit money in a bank, your deposits are insured now up to £80,000. You need that throughout the whole of the Eurozone. But guess what? The Germans don't want that because their banks would end up paying the bill. Just as Mr. Chritensen said they didn't want a fiscal union, which also could underpin the euro. But the euro can't really exist, and this was one of the points that we made endlessly when the euro was being set up, without having a common treasury, without having a common tax system, and a sort of European finance minister or chancellor of the exchequer. That is what it needs, and such a thing would be a nightmare in which there would be no democracy and no accountability. So my conclusion about the euro is that there is this obstinate political will there, which will probably take them a little bit down the road of more and more integration. We need to be sure that we are completely insulated from what happens there and it doesn't spill over effects onto us. That is the great threat to democracy. And I just want, before I end, to address a few remarks just about the other part of the subject, the threat to democracy, the crisis of democracy within the EU. Because I believe this is the real issue. When we have the European elections, or if we have a referendum, there'll be lots of talk about this power, that power, repatriating. That's not really the real issue. The real issue is actually accountability and democracy and the direction in which Europe is going. It's not just where it is now, but where it is threatening to go. And all of us in this room can look to the future and see where it is going. The EU is a sort of bureaucratic dictatorship. Yes, we elect the governments that go to Brussels and behind closed doors strike bargains and then produce legislation. But the fact that our government is there doesn't make it democratic, because these laws, when they're created, can never be reversed. Democracy in Europe is a one-way street. In a national election, if a government introduces a law, another government can and often does come along and repeals it at the next election. Elections are fought about it. But that never happens in Europe. Laws are, it's very difficult to reverse them because they're all negotiated between governments on the basis of horse trading, and thus legislation becomes a one-way street. You get this huge body of law, the acquis communautaire, which gets bigger and bigger with every year. And in that sense, I think talk about repatriating powers is not the real problem. You can repatriate this power or that power, but they'll go on legislating and acquiring more power and passing more laws. And we'll have to then talk about repatriating a whole lot of things that we didn't think of in the first place. The EU is not well known for its regard for democracy. Whenever people in a referendum have voted no, they've been invited always, or forced, to reconsider, and we've gone on having referendums until the right answer for Brussels was produced. Only last week in the House of Lords, we had a debate about the proposed referendum bill that the government wanted to steer through the House of Lords. Labour and Liberal peers, many of them people with close connections with Brussels, many who served in Brussels, showed a real distaste for the whole concept of a referendum. Viviane Reding, the EU Commissioner, said this week that people in the UK, because of the bias of the press, were not capable of making an informed decision about membership of the EU. But, as Mr. Christian said, thank God for plucky little Switzerland. This week, the Swiss people voted quite democratically to restrict immigration into their country. What happened? The EU immediately threatened to tear up decades-old EU-Swiss free trade agreements. It said it was going to stop talks about electricity sharing arrangements between Switzerland and the EU. But a fat lot of good that will do them, because it benefits Germany far more than it benefits Switzerland. They said they were going to carry out their threat to tear up these free trade agreements. As Ian Milne, who I see sitting 3 rows from the back, pointed out to me, the Eurozone exports 250 million euros of exports, and imports only 211. It's hugely dependent on Switzerland as an export market. And they're no more going to carry out their threats than they would carry out these pseudo-threats that we always hear would be applied to Britain if we dared to leave the Eurozone. You know, we used to look down at Switzerland in this country. We would say, well, you can't really compare it with Britain. It's got a completely different structure. They're just into services and cuckoo clocks. But this is actually an economy that's far more integrated with the EU economy than the British economy is. And it also enjoys the highest standard of living of any country in Europe. That's all that's wrong with it. But this series of negotiations between Switzerland and the EU over these free trade arrangements they have is, of course, a wonderful dress rehearsal of what Britain might be able to do in its negotiations with the EU. And I think the British government, who will after all be participating on the EU side of the negotiations with Switzerland, ought to use this as an occasion to establish a precedent and to establish as generous and as wide and favourable a deal to Switzerland as can possibly be done. I think we should be on the side of Switzerland in the negotiations as possible. So this is a dress rehearsal for our negotiations. It couldn't be more important, and we ought to show the world that just like the Swiss, we are determined to govern ourselves and to pass our own laws for our own people through our own parliament.
Thank you very much indeed, Norm. Our next speaker is Professor David Myddelton, Chairman of the Trustees of the Institute of Economic Affairs. David is Emeritus Professor of Finance and Accounting at Cranfield School of Management. He's written many books on accounting, accounting standards, privatisation and the British tax system. His latest works include They Meant Well, Government Project Disasters. David has been a lifelong supporter of sound money. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome David Myddelton.
Yes, well, I was a bit surprised when I got the advertisement for this meeting, because I thought I was going to talk about economics, and there was something about the crisis of democracy in the headline. So I thought perhaps I should start by saying a little bit about democracy. Of course, its great virtue is it gives people the chance every few years to throw the rascals out. I mean, to dismiss our rulers peacefully. We don't have that in the European Union, of course, which is why I've called it an alien tyranny. Alien because it's mostly run by foreigners, tyranny because we can't chuck the rascals out. And obviously, I say obviously, but I think it is clear, not every extension of democracy is a good thing. You only have to think about giving 5-year-olds the vote to realise that. The real problem is not the details of how governments are elected, whether it's first past the post or proportional representation, how the constituencies are made up, the voting age and all that sort of thing. That's not the real problem. The real problem is limiting the powers of government. Otherwise, as my former MP, Lord Hailsham, Quintin Hogg, always used to say, we have an elective dictatorship in this country. He said that when he was in opposition, and funnily enough, when he again became Lord Chancellor in a Conservative government, somehow he never referred to the point again. With British governments now spending about half the national income, in addition to hundreds and thousands of regulations that don't necessarily involve much or any spending, it's clear that we failed miserably in this country in limiting the powers of government. Just two examples of vanity projects that our leaders are even now planning, on which they'll waste vast sums of taxpayers' money. HS2 is one, and nuclear deterrent is another. Yes. I'm sorry, I'm not standing for election, so it's no good trying to encourage me. Cancelling both of them would save a great deal of our money. Yeah. I don't suggest, by the way, the government should spend the money on other worthy projects instead. I suggest they should use it to repay a tiny proportion of the huge amount of government debt that they've been amassing. If they could manage to get the national debt, that is the government debt, down below 40% of national income, where it used to be within living memory, it's currently about 80%, then at that point they might like to consider reducing taxes, cutting tax revenues, and to quote Gladstone, letting the money fructify in the pockets of the taxpayer. I realise it would be a post-war innovation for British governments to repay its borrowing honestly. According to the Retail Prices Index, I'm a very old man now, the pound has lost 98% of its purchasing power in my lifetime, which suggests the government normally prefers the dishonest method of debasing the currency to reduce the real value of their debt. Evidence, I'm afraid, of irresponsibility by a democratic government. But let me now move more generally to the European Union and the economy. And forgive me if I repeat one or two things I've said before, but the other two speakers haven't really talked about what I regard some of the basics of UK membership. And so, as an old teacher, I realise even repeating stuff that people probably know doesn't usually do too much harm. First of all, it's clear that overall the economic costs and benefits from the UK being in the European Union are first small and second pretty evenly balanced. In a word, negligible. Most studies show no net economic benefit from our EU membership. Of course, that's not a reason to leave, but it's not a reason to stay either. Some people pretend that 3 million British jobs might be lost if we were to leave the European Union. Complete rubbish, of course, but I find that quite encouraging. It implies our opponents don't really have many good arguments at their disposal. The fact is, there's no reason to expect any permanent loss of jobs. After all, it's not as if we gained 3 million jobs when we joined the European Union back in 1973. We can trade perfectly well with people and firms on the continent, whether we're in the European Union or not. America, Brazil, China, other countries all through the alphabet manage to trade with the European Union perfectly well from the outside. Why should the UK be different? And tariff levels, of course, are much lower now than they were when we joined. So that even if we were outside, it would be much less worrying than it might have been if we were outside the customs union 40 plus years ago. The economic benefits of EU membership apply to only a small proportion of our economy. A smaller proportion of our exports go to the EU than of any other member state. Yet we suffer the regulations and the rules and all the nonsense on 100% of our economy, which someone a long time ago very aptly said was the tail wagging the dog. Of course we're happy, our households and firms are happy to trade with our friends and neighbours on the continent, as we've done for hundreds of years. We just don't want to be ruled by them. Why did we join in the first place? Well, I remember it well. In 1970, first of all, the common market was viewed as an economic and trade arrangement. Secondly, we thought, most people thought, for 25 years after the war, the German and French economies seem to have done quite well, and relatively the British economy seemed to have done pretty badly. And I don't dissent from that judgment if you think economics is all that matters. Then, of course, along came Mrs. Thatcher, notably helped by Lord Lamont, which we're all very grateful for, and British economies started to recover, while the continental economies faltered. So the economic conditions that some people thought in the 60s and early 70s had made it seem sensible to join this free trade, not free trade, but this trading and economic arrangement, the common market, it began to change. And in the 80s and 90s, soon after we had joined, those conditions obviously no longer obtained. But, although I've talked a little bit about economics, in my view, it's the political arguments that are far, far more important. The whole thing has been political from the start, nothing wrong with that, but let's not kid ourselves. Exactly by this way, exactly the same is true of the approaching referendum in Scotland. My heart sinks when I see Alistair Darling or someone on the other side try to talk about the economics of it all. In my view, that is completely irrelevant. This is a political decision the Scots are going to have to make. I don't say it's an easy decision, it's a political decision. And the analogy I've come to think is relevant, I only thought of it last week, is this. Lots of young people choose to leave home even though they recognise there's a big risk they may be a little bit worse off financially for the first few years because they want independence. That's what it's about. And I wouldn't blame the Scots if they want independence, and I don't blame us in the United Kingdom for wanting our own independence. By the way, if the Scots did vote for independence from the rest of the United Kingdom, and this hasn't been mentioned at all as far as I've seen, they would then have to face the decision whether to join the European Union. And I don't think we should assume automatically that they would choose to do so. They might not. If you really want independence, it doesn't seem to me that joining the European Union is a terribly clever thing to do. Could Britain ever convince the rest of the EU to reform? Lord Lamont mentioned this briefly. In my opinion, not a chance. The Euro fanatics, many of them, to be fair, perfectly sincere, but they're incorrigible. There's absolutely zero chance. We've been global traders for hundreds of years. We've had a worldwide outlook, not a parochial European one. An image strikes me of the 2012 Olympic Games in London. I wasn't a great fan of the nonsense about the Industrial Revolution that we had in the opening ceremony, which seemed to imply that if only it hadn't been for the wretched Industrial Revolution, we could all happily still be playing village cricket on the green. I believe it was a Marxist who was responsible, and that doesn't surprise me. But the point that I would like to draw attention to, about 200 nations marched past in that interminable ceremony. And of those 200 nations, about 100 had either been colonies in the British Empire or had very close, like Argentina and lots of other countries, very close connections with the British Empire. About 100 out of 200. That's an incredibly high proportion, and no other country in the world has anything like such a worldwide network. So if there's any country in the world that can survive on its own, it's us. There was recently an opinion poll. Which asked, which of 5 selected nations would you say Britain has most in common with, culturally, politically, and economically? 2% said these were selected nations. 2% said India, 10% Germany, 11% France, but 28% said Australia, more than India, Germany, and France combined, and 49% said the United States of America. Food for thought there, really, for the Europhiles. Geography matters now far less than it did even 50 years ago. Air travel is much faster and cheaper, as are telecommunications. And of course the internet is revolutionizing business. So being next door to the continent of Europe is no longer that important for trading purposes. As I say, it's a political question, and I was delighted last year when our Prime Minister, David Cameron, made an important point about the Treaty of Rome and its fundamental objective of ever closer union. He said, We in this country have never been comfortable with that aim. Absolutely right, but I've never heard a British Prime Minister say it before. For a long time, most British people couldn't believe the continental politicians were serious about ever closer union. And many Eurosceptics make this mistake still. But don't be fooled. Whatever the views of their electorates, which don't weigh heavily with them, as you know, in fact, the continental European leaders are in deadly earnest. They really do mean it. And I suggest that in the forthcoming negotiations, if they ever happen, we should ask for that unacceptable fundamental objective to be dropped. It's pretty important to us, what they call a red line. And my own view is that that point alone would be enough to scupper the whole thing. I'm conscious that some distinguished statesmen, because I put this point to one the other day, are convinced the European Union's negotiators will be prepared to say anything without having any intention of sticking to it. I don't agree. I think it would be such a humiliating public withdrawal to say we no longer believe it, which in any case they do believe, that I can't imagine they will take it away. But if they did, terrific. That's point 1, and we have point 73 now. Some years ago, by the way, if it were dropped, there would be one very beneficial outcome, namely the European Court of Justice could no longer use ever closer union as a key criterion in their decision-making, which they do at the moment. Disgraceful, because of course it's an entirely political point, but they do. And if it weren't there, presumably, I suppose they are bound to some extent by what's in the Treaty of Rome, they wouldn't. And some years ago, the EEC Official General Guide said economic integration isn't meant to be an end in itself, but merely an intermediate stage on the road to political integration. Well, I don't know about you, but personally, I really don't fancy political integration with Austria, Bulgaria, Croatia, and all the rest. I stopped there in the alphabet because I don't want to mention our friends in Germany. I've been trying recently to tutor a young girl in maths. To begin with, I gave her a short test to see what she knew, but she cheated by using a calculator which wasn't allowed, and then lied about it. One of her problems, she's only 10, is she fancies she's rather a good liar. She thinks she can deceive people. But I'm an old teacher, and you don't have to be an expert to know that someone who can't multiply 8 by 8 is unlikely to be able to multiply a 2-digit number by a 4-digit number in her head, which is what she told me she'd done. I told her it was even more important for me to encourage her to be honest than to try to teach her some maths and not to tell lies. Why do I mention this? I'm talking about the EU. Because the episode reminded me of the European Union. They cheat too, and they tell lies about it. Remember the Lisbon Treaty and all that nonsense when the French and others voted against the Constitution and how the Lisbon Treaty is completely different? Of course it wasn't. So they were cheating and they were lying about it. And they haven't got the excuse of being only 10 years old. It pains me to say it, but they're sort of grown up now. I don't believe their auditors think they're much good at maths either. I needn't, I think, refer in this audience to the Stability and Growth Pact, but that's quite a good example of the way they just ignore international treaties. And the bailouts, or Lamont mentioned this, to Greece, Ireland, Portugal and Cyprus, and the various kinds of assistance to Spain and Italy, it seems to me all clearly breached the terms of the Treaty of Maastricht. But not all continentals care what an international treaty says. This is the 100th anniversary of the outbreak of the First World War. And we declared war, essentially, it's a complicated story, because Germany invaded Belgium and we had treaty obligations in that respect. But they couldn't understand our reasoning. The German Chancellor said we went to war just for a scrap of paper. Now we on this side of the channel think scraps of paper matter. But many of the statesmen on the other side seem not to. These are partners who don't believe in utmost good faith. The European Union certainly has a democratic deficit as well as a financial one. And personally, I don't see any reason to believe that either of these deficits are going to disappear anytime soon. Thank you.
stimulating speeches. I wonder if we can now have some questions. Yes, gentleman on the second.
Why should we continue to give our opponents in this debate benefit of the thought of good faith, as they refer to, when they are habitually rude to us, particularly in these uncertain times?
Repeat the question.
Will anyone on the panel like to comment? David?
I should say I'm not a member of the Conservative Party, and over the years I haven't been all that impressed by their leaders. But I think we've got to be a little bit robust. These are serious questions, they are political questions. People feel strongly about it, and if our opponents are a little bit rude, well, frankly, when we've had to fight opponents who've invaded neighbouring countries over several generations, I really think we can put up with a little bit rudeness. All I would suggest is be a little bit rude back if you feel like it.
Next question. Yes, gentleman on the second. Yes, how about you, sir?
I'd like to take a bit of issue with the remarks about the scrap paper.
You want to take the microphone so we can all hear?
I'd like to take a bit of issue with the Myddelton's remarks about the scrap paper. In fact, when the Belgian Treaty was pulled up from the archives, taken to the cabinet, and they all started looking at it, they had at least 3 different views on whether or not it was Britain should in fact abide by what it was asserted to be guarantees. And in fact, Gladstone made some very interesting remarks, which were quoted by Sir Edward Grey in 1914 in his famous speech. Just one line from that. To say that treaty obligations must be carried out without regard to circumstances is plainly an assertion. And Gladstone then went on to say that treaty obligations should not be carried out without regard to the circumstances. And it seems to me that British politicians don't seem to understand that treaty obligations can only ever be maintained and carried out with taking into account all the relevant circumstances at the time, not a treaty that was signed 40 years ago.
Thank you very much indeed.
Yes, could I respond? I have a lot of sympathy with that view, but remember, it was a complicated question, and when I read the Hansard explaining the setting up the parliamentary debate on 4th of August, or whatever it was, I was horrified at what a pathetic case was made for going to war. And I think I'm a romantic old fool, but I still feel it might have been possible for us not to go to war, even though there was a treaty that one could argue forced us to. But my point was, the German attitude was, it's only a scrap of paper. And somehow that attitude seems to have mysteriously carried over to the European Union, which really doesn't care what the law says. I didn't go on and on about the Stability and Growth Pact, but that's a very good example. You write something into a treaty, and then when it's convenient, you ignore it. So I take your point about the First World War, but I stick to my point about the European Union.
Just amazed at the questioner coming up with this response to David Myddelton's speech. Just sounds like a put-up job to me. But actually, I think you could point out, as I think perhaps David has, that the British had quite a flexible attitude to it too, because I remember that Winston Churchill, no less, said that it wouldn't really matter if the Germans were only going through the southern part of Belgium. Well, that seems to me not really to be observing a very rigid attitude to a treaty commitment to support Belgium. But that was what he argued at the time. But I do agree with the David Myddelton point. I think the EU cites treaties all the time when it wishes to enforce them. Here it is, reading the Riot Act of Switzerland, saying you can't cherry pick, all these treaties are all interrelated. And I think there are many examples. It's one of the things that most alarms me about the EU, a very flexible attitude to law. If you take the first bailout mechanism, the first one that was introduced in order to bail out the Greek and Irish economies, there was no provision in the Treaty of Maastricht for bailing out governments. Indeed, the whole Treaty of Maastricht went to enormous length that it was not possible to bail out other governments, because the Germans were precedently very wise, that they might, very far-sighted, they saw that they might be obliged to be the paymaster of Europe. So there was no provision for a bailout mechanism. But what happened? When, in order to save the euro, they had to rescue Ireland, they reached for a clause in, not the Maastricht Treaty, but in the body of European treaties, which referred to natural disasters. Well, natural disasters meant earthquakes and floods, and allowed you to give assistance to countries in that way. And that's what they used as the bailout, called the first Eurozone crisis. Well, Christian Lagarde subsequently admitted that this was really illegal. And then they altered the treaties to make it legal.
Lars, have you any thoughts on this question of honouring commitments?
Well, Denmark hasn't been doing much in terms of war since the Vikings, right? But those were good days for us. I don't think we worked much with treaties in those times. I think on the first question, I would say the thing about parties that you would suspect would be have some feeling of obligation to defend the national interest, and I think that is a very big problem across Europe, that unfortunately a number of parties that shouldn't logically be supportive of what's going on in Brussels, including some in my own country, it really doesn't stack up against the sort of the ideological foundation. But I unfortunately think that certainly for a small country like Denmark, where there is no other way for a politician to really get into the big league than to get to Brussels and hang out with big leaders from big countries. You might have better opportunity as a British politician, but in Denmark, if you want to hit the big time, you got to go to Brussels, and that unfortunately I think leads to a legitimate support for the system, because it's the only way to really progress your career once you've been a secretary or something or other in Denmark, which is not a particularly prestigious job, managing a small department for 5.6 million people. So you can go to Brussels and you can get big. And unfortunately, I think that confuses a lot of politicians that should know better.
Thank you very much. Sir.
Roger Kendrick. We've heard a very convincing analysis, and we hear it regularly at the Bruges Group. My fear is we've got a referendum that may happen, and when it does, everything is going to be ranked against Eurosceptics and coming out. I think the people in the country generally may not understand all the arguments, the economics and all the rest of it, but their gut instinct on the one hand is that they don't like Europe. But on the other hand, you're going to have David Cameron, who said he won't campaign to come out. You've got the BBC, you've got the whole of the establishment, you've got the whole of the Labour Party, the whole of the Lib Dems, with all the stuff that they come out with all the time. And my concern is that people, like they did in the AB referendum, won't necessarily vote for change because they get scared. And this is where I think the Bruges Group is failing. I'm sorry to say it, but I'll use that word. And that is that if we're going to win a referendum, we need to present an alternative to the British people. And the British people need to understand that. And we need to have an alternative that the pro-anti-European people can campaign on, and it needs to be one that's credible. And I would put in a plea that the Bruges Group actually puts in some work to get an alternative presentation to put to the British people. And I think one of the things that should include is that it's about Independence Day, because I think independence is something that people might actually vote for rather than coming out.
Roger. We have, in fact, put in a 20,000 word submission today for the Brexit Prize, which is all about how we get out and what we should achieve by getting out. We can't publish it because David Middleton's got copyright on it, as the head of the IEA. But I'm sure he's going to be doing a tremendous job actually publishing the winning entries for this €100,000 prize. Norman, we saw all these establishment people in the House of Lords 2 weeks ago, basically putting the case for staying in the EU and not wanting countenance change. How do you see a successful campaign for changing our relationship with the EU developing?
Well, I think the question is right. There will be a huge array of people with a lot of misinformation. You will have a lot of business, and I don't think business is intentionally seeking to distort the argument. Businessmen are frankly nervous, don't really have the faith that they can make this leap into the unknown, but they have this uncertainty in their own mind, and that communicates itself. So I think that will be formidable. I think an argument that you'll get that will be quite difficult to meet, but there are answers, is this government by facts. The argument that if you're outside the EU, but within some free trade arrangement with it, you have no control over the regulations, and you just get a fax telling you what the EU has decided. I think this is vastly overstated, but I think it's quite a sort of difficult point to overcome. I think your idea of using the word independence is a good one. Alex Salmon doesn't like the word independence being used. He doesn't like the word separate being used. He sort of likes to give the... In fact, if you look at what Alex Salmon is saying, he's rather implying that the Queen will stay, the pound will stay, the defence orders in Scottish shipyards will say things are going to remain the same in order to change. It's rather bizarre. I think one's just got to... I haven't got an easy answer to the question. I think if you want to argue the out case, you have to argue that we are perfectly capable as a global nation with worldwide interests of trading with anybody. This is all a lot of nonsense about 3 million jobs. You've got to be robust and stand up and say, for goodness sake, can't we govern ourselves? I think the argument about accountability and democracy, which I would guess people are unanimous in this room about, I find it's very difficult to get over to people in the public generally. They don't see it. They don't see it because this hasn't impinged on major issues. You can say, well, isn't it unfair that insurance premiums between men and women have been equalised without anyone having any say? How do you revert? That's not the sort of issue that actually sways people. A lot of these issues are very, very technical. You can use the immigration as one. You can say, do you or don't you wish to regain control of your borders? But I think it's very difficult getting this argument across about national accountability, sovereignty and democracy.
David?
I think this question of, what will become of us if we leave the European Union is a perfectly natural human one. But the question I would ask is, what will become of the European Union in the future? I mean, this is a declining body. If you look at the demographics, they are absolutely disastrous. Most of these countries are going to lose a lot of population. So I would say, look, this is a tricky decision. In my opinion, it's a political decision. Of course the future is unknown. It always has been. But it's unknown if we stay in, just as it's unknown if we come out. Now that may be a bit too intellectual and academic an approach, but the future is uncertain. And I think the real question for this political decision about independence is, do we still have the self-confidence we once had or not? And I must admit, just asking the question makes me a little bit nervous, because I'm not sure we, and I mean by that partly our political leaders, do have the self-confidence. Maybe we do feel it would be more comfortable in a big block with other people, so if we go down, we all go down together. I have no intention of going down, so I want independence, because I think this is a sinking ship we're stuck on at the moment.
against the vote. Government and the Parliament were pretty unanimous. It was really the people against the political class plus business. It was a formidable array.
Well, very much so. I mean, it was very much the establishment against a certain part of the population. I must admit, I think there were parts of that vote that was of the proposal that was less positive than you would want to, because there's also certainly an anti-German element in it. You know, that actually is not all about bad immigrants coming and taking all the social aspects of it, but it's also sort of there's too many people coming in here pressing up the price of a house, so they have a slightly different problem. We have rich people coming there, taking some of the better jobs and sending the house prices through the roof. So it's kind of a different argument than you probably have in most other countries, but at the end of the day, it was appealing to Switzerland has hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of history as a neutral and self-sustaining nation. Swiss are very big on self-sustaining, very much protecting their farmlands and stuff like that, because they want to be self-sufficient on any thinkable conditions. So it's very much around, you know, we have a history, we have a Swiss way of doing things, and these people are changing that in a way that we're not comfortable with, right? And that's very strong arguments, and the numbers I mentioned, about 23% foreigners being 45% of the social cost and 45% approximately the unemployed people there, was sort of distributed door to door, and some fairly emotional material with this huge tree pulling up the roots of Switzerland. You know, it's a very, very emotional picture. You know, they like good pictures down there, because we wrote about everything. Believe it or not, we had a vote about whether you could serve sausage on petrol stations not so long ago. Right? So we wrote on many things, right? But it was, of course, the emotional aspect, and I think that given that you have to move here a large part of the population, the only thing that will truly appeal is an emotional aspect, and I agree with the independence and, of course, the phenomenal history of Britain and its importance in the world. I think this is clearly the way to go, and why would you want to hand that over to a Portuguese ex-communist or ex-communist?
Okay, gentlemen just behind you then on the second row from the back. Yes, over the next shirt.
Sorry.
The overneck shirt, just on the other side of the arse.
Right.
Sorry. Yes, that gentleman there. No, the one absolutely on the aisle. That's all.
No, that's right.
I'll come back to you, sir.
Thank you for your talk this evening. Are we making a mountain of a molehill here? If you look at liberation movements, they generally require action. And any referendum here would be an advisory referendum. And the money that would be used for that advisory referendum would be our money. 326 people in Parliament can't seem to get their act together for 20 years to organise a referendum, so why don't we do it ourselves? Newly formed countries have had bureaucracies, and their new voter rolls and everything organized in 10 weeks. We can do this ourselves. Since the trade union reforms in the 1980s, there are so many voting organisations around the country, we can do this ourselves. So as anti-EU groups, what we need to do is actually lead by example and just say, well, 80% of the population want to vote. The AD referendum costs 80 million, so 44 million voters, about 20 quid each. I think we can afford that. We probably have 80 people in the country with £1 million who are able to, just back it up just in case we didn't get enough funds. So what I'm saying is, why don't we organise the referendum ourselves? Why don't we do it before the next election, say February, so if they haven't repealed the European Communities Act, those MPs can get the boot. And let's choose something that not only that we can win here, well, which is say the EFTA option of Norway, but Denmark could win, Sweden could win, Finland could win, Northern European countries could rejoin EFTA. Thank you.
Can I just briefly refer to the point made by the gentleman about the possibility of treaties? I think with respect, the problem is that in international law, there's been a long-standing principle called pacta sunt servanda, In other words, the treaties must be observed. It goes back hundreds of years to the Dutch jurist Grotius and many others. I thought I'd just make that one. But, my question is to Lord Lamont. You said towards the end of your speech that you thought the doctrine of acquis communautaire may not be such a serious issue. Yet is it not the case that David Cameron is trying to persuade the British people that he's going to repatriate powers from the centre back to the nation states? And yet, as Christopher Booker, in a quite remarkable article in The Spectator this week, has shown that there's been an accretion of powers to the centre ever since 1914, and it's only its culmination in the present times. And of course, what it means is that once the Commission has made a decision to collect powers to the centre, the Lisbon Treaty in Article 38 says that there has to be a vote of all the member states of the European Union, in other words, 27 states, for any powers to be repatriated. So in fact, David Cameron is indulging, I'm afraid, in a fraud. These powers will not be repatriated in law. And again, we are going to be sold something which is just an untruth. Would you care to comment on that?
What David Cameron has said is that he will attempt to renegotiate. He will then place the proposed renegotiated terms before the British people, and they can vote either for leaving the EU or accepting the renegotiated terms. So if you think the renegotiated terms are not satisfactory or in some sense fraudulent, you vote to get out. You've got the choice.
What renegotiated?
Well, if you don't believe it's possible, I would say, well, wait and see. But if you don't believe that any significant powers have been repatriated, then you vote no. That's the choice you're given. So I don't really see what your complaint is.
Thank you. Lars, have you any thoughts on this point we've had about organising our own referendum? Would that work in this country or in other European countries?
I think it's an interesting thought. I'll tell you one thing we did on a different discussion in Denmark. I support a very small party, still a very small party that we created about 5 years ago. It's got about 5% of the vote is in Parliament with 9 seats. We don't have as many in our Parliament as you have in yours. But one thing we did at the last election was to try to make it about tax, which is a big issue in Denmark being the highest taxed nation in the world. So we made a website as a bank actually, and said that we would promote any politician that actually would commit to working for lower taxes. And you know, after like a week, we only had our own candidates. So that was any candidate, not just any sitting parliament. After a week, we only had the candidates of our own party. But then there was like a few of the other guys saying, hey, these guys are actually pushing aggressively with advertising people that promote lower taxes. We actually also in favor of this, although we're from a different party. So they began to sign up over the next few days. And actually in the end, the Conservative Party that is actually not that keen on taxes in Denmark called up and said, we want all of our candidates on this list. Can you put them on? All of them, right? And so the funny thing is when you expose people for something where they should have a given view, like a Conservative in Denmark should be in favor of lower taxes, and if he sees himself not being on a heavily promoted website where other people are being promoted for that point of view, it makes them nervous and actually they come running and then want to be part of it. So I mean, that's just one way we did it, but exposing people that you would say, well, this guy clearly should be skeptical at least vis-a-vis the EU, so can he commit to it? And if he's not, at least you have there black on white that this particular person, if you have that view about the EU, should not be voting for him in your local election either next time you get the chance. So that's one idea at least for promoting and giving people a little bit of accountability for their point of view.
Thank you. David, any thoughts on these questions?
Yes, I want to make a couple of points. I'm an accountant, but when it came to voting in the 1975 referendum, I'd been quite influenced by all the stuff about economics in the accounts. And it was only when I actually got into the voting booth and thought about what I was doing that I thought, I just can't do it. We're too different. It was an emotional spasm, if you like. Now, if a desiccated calculating machine like me can be overcome by emotion, I do think it's worth underlining that point, that the decision is not going to be made on what you might call rational grounds. There's nothing irrational about emotion, but so I think we've got to be prepared to play the emotion card, if I can put it that way, very, very strongly and not get sucked into a nonsensical argument about economics. The second point I want to make is I don't altogether agree with the gentleman that I think this promise by the Prime Minister, if he's re-elected, to try to negotiate some repatriation of powers from the European Union is extremely helpful. And I'm a little nervous about organising our own referendum in a hurry. I mean, it's a nice idea, but my feeling is if there somehow miraculously were to be a referendum today or tomorrow, we would lose it. People need quite a long time to get used to the idea, and they need to be soothed, as we've been saying. So personally, I think it will work quite nicely as a process. Cameron re-elected, perhaps. Renegotiation, perhaps. A few pathetic powers repatriated, possibly, nothing very significant. So he's failed, maybe chucked out by the Conservative Party, by the way. He says, oh, well, I'm going to recommend we stay in anyway. I mean, it's unpredictable what will happen. But the point is, people who are teetering on voting for coming out will be able to say, and we will be able to argue, look, we did all we could. We sat down, we tried to be reasonable, we tried to negotiate, and they've insulted us by doing absolutely damn all by way of repatriation. They haven't been listening, or they're not prepared to give us anything. So I think that actually provides quite a good springboard for a no vote in the referendum when it comes, if we play our cards right.
Yes, gentlemen with the glasses. On the go with it, just by
just a question. Would it be more straightforward, maybe this is for Lord Lamont, for Cameron to serve as, I think it's Article 50 notice on the EU, which basically says we'll negotiate with on terms, and if we can't agree the terms, we're going to get out. Isn't that the legal position under Article 50? And wouldn't that be a much more straightforward way of doing it? And also, I just like to add that immigration is certainly one we should really for, because that's what will get us out of Europe. Thank you.
gentleman there, blue shirt, pink tie.
Thank you. Yes, just to follow on to that, I can speak that. Yeah, with Article 50, it takes 3 years to renegotiate. Do you not think market volatility to games the UK economy would simply repeal the 1972 European Union Act be a more straightforward option?
Okay, both of these questions are turned out on Article 50. I think that's going to happen anyway. Under Article 50, you have to give 2 years' notice, and then you start the renegotiations. I think the questioner is suggesting there's no need to go for a referendum first. We just go for Article 50. Is that correct? Yeah. So rather than spend 2 years having what is likely to be a pretty meaningless renegotiation, we go for a straight route. Norman, any thoughts on this?
No, I personally think it's right to have a referendum. I do believe in referenda only for constitutional issues, how we are governed. I feel that the only people who can decide how we are governed, what constitutes one's identity, that is a question for the people. And I feel a referendum would be, there are people who are going to be very strongly in favour of our remedy. We need a decision that is legitimate, that has a clear result, and I think rather than the government imposing it, I think it would be better to put it to the people and to have a referendum. I'm all for a referendum.
Thank you very much. Yes, gentlemen with the open white shirt. Yes, please, sir.
I'd just like to take this on a little bit further and say, this and the result is we're going to get out. Now the trouble is we've got a quisling political class who will do everything possible to get us tied back in by one means or another. They'll come along with things like the Norway option or the Swiss option. And of course, the Norway option and the Swiss option the Swiss option possibly until yesterday, is the fact that you're tied in with the four so-called freedoms, the freedom of movement of services, goods, capital, and most important, labour. So my question is quite simple. Bearing in mind this unfortunate fact, namely a quisling political class, how on earth can we rely on a renegotiation being an honest renegotiation, even after the British public have said, get out? Thank you.
Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, nothing very profound. You can't, of course, guarantee it, but it's our best bet. I agree with Norman. You must have a referendum so we can see what the people want, and that does give it legitimacy. And the quisling political class, as you call them, I think would be, I mean, they're pretty discredited now, but they would be a hell of a lot more discredited if there'd been a get-out referendum and it never happened.
Well, I imagine in the event of a get-out decision, even if that had been imposed by members of the government, I imagine the cabinet would have a free vote, as they did at the time of the Lawson referendum. Possibly not, but that's what I would have thought was wise. I would have thought the cabinet might be split. I would have thought if the referendum went in no direction, you would then probably have a government formed of those who had supported that decision, who would then decide on the way in which that would be implemented. That would be the logical constitutional thing to do.
Thank you very much. Yes, gentleman there.
Okay, one for that?
Yeah.
Yes.
We're talking about referendum now, right? But there is a referendum in May this year. That will be a referendum on the EU. And if the anti-EU people, such as UKIP, get good results with backing from people like the Bruges group, with your professionalism, your knowledge, we could get good results from UKIP or other people like them, and that would be a referendum. And then Cameron would have to be positive and do something before the next election. So what are we going to do? This is the chance. This is the referendum. This is the people's referendum in Britain, in the UK, while it's still in the UK.
Thank you very much.
Yes, comment on.
I don't think that is the case, unfortunately, because the turnout for the European elections is more likely to be 20%. You get a very, very low turnout. I don't think you could possibly make a decision about our membership of the EU just based on the turnout in the European elections. And forgive me, sir, but I might point out that the Bruges group is not allied formally to UKIP.
Thank you. Gentleman on the getaway with the black coat, yes, sir. Gentleman.
Thank you. I have a general question. The chairman mentioned the famous meeting between Rothschilds and Thatcher. So my question is, why does the panel think, why is it that the global financial, political, cultural, media elites are so much in favour of the European Union, so much in favour of ever closer union, even to the extent of wanting circuit drawing? Why? My question is why.
Thank you very much. Lars, I've got a feeling this is a question that you thought about quite a bit, and you've got quite a bit of expertise in this area.
I know many people in the financial industry that take an extremely skeptical view of the EU and certainly of the euro. I mean, I don't actually know very many financially savvy people that think that the euro has a chance at hell of surviving, right? So I think it's not necessarily right that there's a big support for it, but there is a nightmare situation in the banking industry today where you know the banks are forced. I'm not being an apologist here because I think a lot of banks made a lot of horrible mistakes, but you try to be a big Spanish bank and not buy Spanish government bonds. You try to be a big Greek bank or a big Cyprus bank, not backing up around Greek in Cyprus bonds. You know, you're forced into some kind of evil collaboration with the governments here, right? And of course, as you have to buy these useless pieces of paper, then you get into financial problems. You need a bailout. You get more dependent. You get fines. You get regulated. So you have a situation here where I fear very much for if we will even have a free banking sector. If you can argue that we have it now, but whether we'll have that 10 years from now, it's a very, very evil cycle that we're into here. And so at the end of the day, the banks don't have much choice other than collaborating. And I don't think it's with their goodwill. I mean, I was to Cyprus a couple of times just before the things went really wrong down there, speaking to a couple of the senior bankers down there, and they felt they had zero choice in terms of what they had to do in terms of supporting the Greek financial system and the government borrowing system, right? So they were kind of painted up into a corner, and they didn't have much of a choice because you cannot not support your government as a big bank in a eurozone country today. So you end up having to sit with these things on your balance sheet, and ultimately you're going to need a bailout, right? And that just eternalizes the situation. I would support your point though, because I just want to say that I think also that the European elections are pretty important. You know, it's certainly not a referendum of in anybody's imagination, but it is very important to send some signals here. I think I would hope that you could also vote Conservative and send a signal that it's not just UKIP that sends a signal, but that's for you guys to figure out. But it is very important across Europe that you see signals now to politicians. The only thing that will change politicians and their natural self-interest is if they feel that the voters are going in a different direction. So it's no longer in their interest to be against their populations. And the EU Parliament election is a good opportunity to really make a point here. And I think a strong point will be made, although of course it will be with relatively low participation. But I think it is important, and I think it is very, very key that people understand this is the time to at least send a message.
The truth is, we shouldn't have a European Parliament. That's the worst thing about it.
Okay, I'll take a final question. Gentleman on the third. Yes, please, sir. Yes.
John Stratton. Should we be demanding from David Cameron what his red lines or his objectives should be prior to the referendum and the renegotiation? Because if he won't tell us, I don't think people will believe that it will be a serious renegotiation. And what will happen is that after the event, it will all be spun as a great victory, even if the most minor things have been achieved.
Yeah, well, I agree that there is a danger to be spun as a great victory when only marginal adjustments have been made. I personally have faith in the British people that they can see that. I have faith in people in this room, the electorate in general, if there are no adjustments made, and the press commenting on it all, I think that would become very obvious. I think you're right that at some point, I'm not saying yes to do it now, but obviously in advance of the negotiations, the government have to say what their aims are. Not in precise detail, but what sort of areas they're thinking should be for repatriation. I mean, I think all this may come up at the time when the Germans themselves want to have a treaty revision. And the Germans are wanting to get various treaty revisions because of the way the Eurozone is working. There will be, therefore, I think, a bit of an alliance between Germany and Britain. We will be wanting different things. We will be wanting to safeguard our position and to make our membership, this will be Cameron's objective, on completely different terms from those of other members. Germany is wanting to shore up its own position within the Eurozone. I think there can be trade-offs there. I think there are moves in certain European countries, particularly Holland, for a degree of centralisation. But at the end of the day, I think people are perfectly capable of making up their minds whether this significantly changes the nature of our membership. And if they don't think it does, they can vote no.
David Myddelton, you've got a comment on this?
Yes, there's a bit of a discussion going on at the moment between the two main coalition partners, the Conservative Party and the Liberal Party, about whether they should publish red lines before the 2015 election, so that if there is another hung parliament, people will know where they stand. And personally, I think that's a big mistake. I think you don't go into negotiations with all your key points spelled out in public. I'm perfectly content to let our Prime Minister go into negotiations with, if you like, a secret agenda. Personally, I think his secret agenda is to stay in the EU, so I don't So I entirely agree with Norman Lamont, and if you don't, I think you have to ask yourself, well, why are you in favour of democracy? If you don't trust the people in a country with a moderately free press, and by the way, the press is far more on our side this time than it was in 1975. That's one important change. So that if the results of a renegotiation, whether genuine or really rather phony, if from our point of view they're very unsatisfactory, there are plenty of people in the press who will certainly point it out in enormous detail, so that people have every chance of seeing what's happened. Now they may say, better the devil you know, they may say, well, it's not much of a renegotiation, not a lot has changed, but they may still hesitate and refuse to vote no. It's our job to persuade them.
Lars, could we have your comments on this final point?
Well, just to put a little bit more burden on everybody's shoulders, I will remind you that although this is important for Britain, I also think that given that Britain is the clear leader of countries that are not members of the Eurozone in terms that in many different ways, you know, the decisions that are made here hold a lot of importance for some of the smaller countries that are also very uncomfortable about this situation. And in countries like Denmark, Sweden, I think Finland, even being a member of the Eurozone, also having taken thoughts, I think if Britain does the right thing and shows courage and shows an independent streak, that will help a lot of the rest of us also making some more brave decisions. So please think of us in that context as well. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've had three outstanding speakers this evening who have got very different experiences, and they've all got tremendous expertise on this subject. And I'd be grateful if you could show your appreciation for the thoughts that they've shared with us.